The evening was supposed to be a celebration, but for Melissa, it turned into a nightmare. Greg had insisted on attending the company's annual holiday gala, and Melissa had spent hours preparing. She wanted to support him, to show that even if she wasn't part of the corporate world, she could still belong. She chose an elegant black dress, understated yet sophisticated, and styled her hair just the way Greg liked. The ballroom shimmered with chandeliers, and Greg was in his element, mingling with colleagues and basking in their admiration. Melissa stood quietly by his side, smiling politely as introductions were made. But as the evening progressed, she felt increasingly invisible. Greg barely acknowledged her, engrossed in conversations about quarterly reports and investment strategies. It wasn't until a group gathered near the bar that Melissa became the center of attention, for all the wrong reasons. "Melissa doesn't really get this corporate stuff," Greg said with a laugh, his voice loud enough to turn heads. "She's more of a home hobbyist." The group chuckled, some nervously, others outright. Melissa felt the color drain from her face. Greg continued, oblivious to her discomfort. "She's great at redecorating, though. You should see our living room." The humiliation burned like a brand. Melissa wanted to disappear, but instead, she straightened her back, forced a smile, and excused herself to the restroom. The tears came quickly, but she dabbed them away before they could ruin her makeup. Staring at her reflection, she barely recognized the woman in the mirror. That night, Melissa made a decision: she would no longer let Greg diminish her. The gala wasn't the first time Greg had undermined her, but it was the most public. At home, his criticisms were subtle, woven into the fabric of their everyday life. If Melissa bought groceries on sale, Greg would smirk. "Stretching my hard-earned dollars, I see." If she spent an afternoon volunteering at the local shelter, he'd shake his head. "You're always busy with meaningless tasks." It wasn't always this way. When they first married, Greg had praised Melissa's sacrifices, calling her the backbone of their household. But as his career climbed higher, his gratitude turned into contempt. He started staying out late, dismissing Melissa's concerns as nagging. Her attempts to talk about their relationship were met with derision. "You're too sensitive," he'd say. "I don't have time for your insecurities." Each remark chipped away at Melissa's confidence. She began doubting herself, questioning whether she really was as unmotivated as Greg claimed. But deep down, a small voice reminded her of the woman she used to be, the ambitious, creative person who had dreams of her own. She clung to that memory, even as Greg's words echoed in her mind. Tension between them grew, reaching a boiling point one quiet evening at home. Greg arrived late, his tie loosened, his mood sour. Melissa had prepared his favorite dinner, hoping to bridge the growing distance between them. But as soon as he sat down, he started complaining about a client meeting. "They're as clueless as you," he muttered, not even looking up. Melissa froze. "What's that supposed to mean?" she asked, her voice steady but tight. Greg set down his fork and stared at her. "It means I'm carrying this family, Melissa. You have no idea what it's like to be under constant pressure while you sit around all day." "I don't sit around," she snapped, surprising even herself. "I keep this house running, Greg. I've supported you every step of the way, and all you do is tear me down." For a moment, Greg looked taken aback. Then his face hardened. "If you're so unhappy, maybe you should leave." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Melissa's heart pounded. She had thought about leaving before, but hearing Greg say it aloud was like a slap in the face. She didn't respond, but the seed of her departure was firmly planted. That night, Melissa couldn't sleep. She replayed Greg's words over and over, each repetition solidifying her resolve. By morning, she called Jenna, her childhood friend and one of the few people she trusted. They met at a small cafe, where Melissa poured out everything, Greg's insults, his indifference, and the moment he told her to leave. Jenna listened intently, her expression a mixture of sympathy and anger. "Melissa, you're stronger than this," she said. "He's trying to make you believe you're nothing without him. But you're more than enough." Melissa blinked back tears, grateful for Jenna's support. "I don't even know where to start," she admitted. "Start by remembering who you are," Jenna said firmly. "What happened to your writing? You used to love it. Maybe it's time to find yourself again." The words struck a chord. Melissa hadn't written in years, but the idea of reconnecting with that part of herself sparked something inside her. For the first time in a long time, she felt a glimmer of hope. Greg's behavior grew colder in the days that followed. He barely spoke to Melissa, and when he did, his words were clipped and dismissive. One evening, after another tense dinner, Greg dropped a bombshell. "I've been thinking," he said. "Maybe it's time for us to take a break. You can go figure out whatever it is you need to, and I can focus on work." Melissa stared at him, her chest tightening. "A break? You mean you want me to leave?" Greg shrugged. "If that's what it takes." "I can't keep carrying this dead weight, Melissa." The words were like a slap, but instead of breaking her, they steeled her resolve. Melissa stood, her voice steady. "You're right, Greg. It's time for a break. But don't think for a second that I'm the one who's dead weight." That night, she packed a suitcase and walked out the door. She didn't know exactly where she was going, but she knew one thing: she was finally free. Melissa's new apartment was small and unassuming, but it felt like a sanctuary. The walls were a pale beige, the furniture sparse, but the air was hers to breathe freely. She unpacked slowly, sorting through remnants of her old life. Wedding photos, decorative trinkets Greg had insisted on buying, they all went into a box that she shoved into the back of the closet. Melissa wanted no reminders of the life she had left behind. Adjusting to life on her own was harder than she expected. Her part-time job at the library offered some stability, but it barely covered rent and groceries. Still, the routine of shelving books and helping patrons gave her a sense of purpose. Nights were the hardest. Alone in the quiet apartment, Melissa found herself confronting years of suppressed feelings. Anger, sadness, and even relief swirled together, keeping her awake. But there was also a flicker of something new, possibility. For the first time in years, Melissa felt like she was living on her terms, no longer subject to Greg's constant criticisms. Every morning, as she left her apartment and felt the crisp air on her face, she reminded herself, this was a beginning, not an end. The library had always been a quiet refuge for Melissa, but one evening, while organizing the community board, she spotted a bright flyer. Creative Writing Workshop, Tuesdays at 6 p.m. Her fingers brushed over the paper as memories of her college years resurfaced. Writing had once been her passion, but she hadn't touched a pen in years. Something inside her stirred, a mix of curiosity and apprehension. The first class was intimidating. Melissa sat at the edge of a circle of strangers, clutching a notebook and feeling out of place. The facilitator, a warm and encouraging woman named Elena, asked everyone to share their reasons for joining. When it was Melissa's turn, her voice wavered. "I used to write," she said. I stopped a long time ago, but I want to see if I still can. When she read her first piece, a short reflection on starting over, the room fell silent. Then came the applause. Melissa blinked, surprised by the reception. She left that night feeling a spark she hadn't felt in years. The words she had buried deep inside were finally finding their way back to the surface. Melissa began attending the workshop religiously. Each week, she shared pieces of her life through her writing, bearing parts of herself she had long hidden. The process was cathartic, and the feedback from her peers gave her a confidence she hadn't felt in years. Her stories, often inspired by her struggles with Greg, resonated deeply with the group. One evening, Elena pulled her aside after class. "Melissa, you have a gift," she said. "You should consider submitting your work to a magazine or contest." The idea seemed far-fetched, but the seed had been planted. Over the next few weeks, Melissa worked tirelessly on a story about resilience and rediscovery. When she finally hit submit on her first submission, her hands trembled. Though she wasn't sure if anything would come of it, she felt proud of herself for trying. Balancing her job and writing wasn't easy. Melissa often found herself burning the midnight oil, her small apartment illuminated by the soft glow of her laptop screen. Her desk was covered with sticky notes, outlines, and half-finished drafts. The exhaustion was real, but so was the joy she felt when the words flowed. Rejection letters started trickling in, each one a blow to her fragile confidence. On particularly hard days, she considered giving up, but the workshop kept her grounded. Her peers reminded her that even the best writers faced rejection, and their encouragement reignited her determination. Melissa began to realize that her journey wasn't just about proving Greg wrong. It was about proving to herself that she could create a life worth living, a life fueled by passion and purpose. One afternoon, Melissa met Jenna for coffee at their favorite cafe. The comforting aroma of roasted beans filled the air as they chatted about Melissa's progress in the workshop. But their conversation took an unexpected turn when two women at a nearby table mentioned Greg's name. Melissa froze, pretending not to eavesdrop as they discussed Greg's affair with a coworker, a secret he had apparently kept hidden for years. Her stomach churned as the pieces fell into place. The late nights, the unexplained absences, the constant criticisms, it all made sense now. Jenna looked at her, concern etched on her face. "Are you okay?" Melissa took a deep breath, her anger simmering beneath the surface. "I'm fine," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. But as she walked home that evening, she couldn't stop thinking about Greg's betrayal. Instead of breaking her, the revelation fueled her resolve. She would use the pain, the anger, and the injustice to fuel her writing. For the first time, Melissa felt like she had control over her story. Melissa sat at her desk, staring at a blank page on her laptop. The betrayal she'd learned about only days before swirled in her mind, her emotions a storm she could barely contain. She clenched her fists, then placed them on the keyboard, letting the anger and pain spill out into words. Her story wasn't just about Greg, it was about every toxic relationship, every moment of doubt, and every instance of someone underestimating her. For hours, she wrote, her fingers moving faster than her thoughts. She didn't stop to edit or second-guess herself, she just wrote. By the time she finally paused, the first draft of a new short story was complete. Melissa leaned back in her chair, exhausted but exhilarated. For the first time, she felt like she was reclaiming control, not just of her writing, but of her life. The next time she attended the workshop, Melissa shared her story. The room was silent as she finished reading, the weight of her words lingering in the air. Elena was the first to speak. "This is powerful," she said. "You've tapped into something real, something raw. Don't let go of it." Melissa nodded, her determination reignited. Weeks later, Melissa received an email that made her gasp. Her short story had been accepted for publication in a local literary magazine. The payment was modest, but the validation was priceless. She reread the email several times, her disbelief gradually giving way to pride. She called Jenna immediately to share the news, and Jenna's whoop of joy on the other end of the line made Melissa laugh. When the magazine arrived in the mail, Melissa held it in her hands, marveling at the sight of her name in print. It felt surreal, like a dream she hadn't dared to believe in. She carried the magazine to the library, showing it to her colleagues and even some regular patrons who had cheered her on. "You're famous now," one of them joked, and for the first time, Melissa felt like she was on the cusp of something bigger. That night, as she sat in her small apartment with the magazine on her coffee table, she allowed herself to feel the weight of her accomplishment. It wasn't just a story. It was proof that she could build a life on her terms, independent of Greg or anyone else. With her first publication under her belt, Melissa began to dream bigger. She started outlining a novel, an idea that had been percolating in the back of her mind for weeks. It would be a story of resilience, inspired by her own journey but with a fictional twist. The protagonist would face her own demons, but ultimately, she would rise stronger than ever. Melissa's days became a blur of work and writing. She woke early to scribble down ideas before her library shift, and she stayed up late refining chapters. The small desk in her apartment was soon covered with sticky notes, outlines, and printed drafts. Writing the novel was harder than she had imagined. It required discipline, patience, and a willingness to confront her deepest fears. But with each page she completed, Melissa felt herself growing. The shy, uncertain woman she had been was fading, replaced by someone more confident, more determined. For the first time in years, she felt like she was living with purpose. While Melissa was rebuilding her life, Greg's was slowly unraveling. His arrogance, once tolerated by his colleagues, had turned into a liability. Poor decisions and reckless investments had cost the company significant clients, and whispers of a leadership change grew louder. Greg tried to maintain his facade of control, but the cracks were visible to everyone around him. At home, Greg found little solace. The lavish house he had once flaunted felt empty, its rooms echoing with silence. His social circle had shrunk, and the adoration he craved was nowhere to be found. For the first time, Greg began to question his own choices. But his pride prevented him from admitting his failures, even to himself. As Greg's professional reputation crumbled, he began to notice Melissa's growing success. Through mutual acquaintances, he heard whispers of her published story, her workshops, and even her plans for a novel. The realization that she was thriving without him stung more than he cared to admit. Melissa's novel was slowly taking shape, and with it, so was her sense of self. She no longer defined herself by Greg's criticisms or anyone else's expectations. Instead, she focused on her goals, her growth, and the people who supported her unconditionally. One evening, while organizing her notes, Melissa stumbled across an old journal she had kept during her marriage. Flipping through the pages, she was struck by how much she had endured: Greg's condescension, his dismissive remarks, and his betrayal. But instead of anger, she felt a sense of clarity. Melissa realized that her journey wasn't about proving Greg wrong, it was about proving herself right. She had always been capable, always been worthy. Greg's words had never defined her, and now, they had no power over her. Closing the journal, Melissa smiled. She wasn't writing just a novel, she was writing her life, one page at a time. The first draft of Melissa's novel was finally complete. Stacks of paper and digital notes filled her small apartment, each page a testament to her determination. The protagonist's story mirrored Melissa's own, a journey of struggle, resilience, and ultimate triumph. While deeply personal, the novel also explored universal themes of self-worth and the courage to rebuild after adversity. Melissa knew the hard part wasn't over. She began the painstaking process of revising her manuscript, spending long nights cutting unnecessary sections, refining dialogue, and ensuring the story's flow was seamless. At times, the work felt overwhelming, and doubts crept in. Was the story good enough? Would anyone care? But each time those thoughts arose, Melissa reminded herself why she had started. This was her voice, her truth. Submitting the manuscript to publishers was nerve-wracking. Rejection letters arrived quickly at first, but instead of discouraging her, they fueled her determination. Each rejection was a step closer to the right opportunity. Melissa pressed on, confident that her story deserved to be told. The rejections piled up, each one a sting that Melissa couldn't ignore. One publisher described her work as promising but not marketable, while another said the manuscript lacked broad appeal. Melissa read each letter carefully, taking notes on the feedback and using it to improve her writing. But some days, the weight of the criticism felt too heavy to bear. During a particularly discouraging week, Melissa considered putting the novel aside. "Maybe I'm not cut out for this," she confided to Jenna over coffee. But Jenna wouldn't hear it. "Melissa, you've come too far to give up now. You don't need every publisher to believe in you, just one." Jenna's words stayed with her, and Melissa threw herself back into the work. She made revisions, tightening the plot and sharpening her prose. She also researched smaller publishers that specialized in heartfelt, character-driven stories. Eventually, she found one that felt like the perfect fit and sent her manuscript with a renewed sense of hope. Months later, an envelope arrived in Melissa's mailbox. It was from the small publisher she had been most excited about. Her hands trembled as she opened it, her eyes scanning the page until they landed on the words, "We are thrilled to offer you a contract for publication." Melissa let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, tears welling in her eyes. The publisher's enthusiasm was infectious. They believed in her story and wanted to market it as a novel of empowerment and resilience. Melissa signed the contract and began collaborating with their editorial team to refine the manuscript further. Seeing her work treated with such care and respect was a new experience, and it gave her confidence in her abilities as a writer. The publisher planned a modest launch event at a local bookstore. Melissa felt both nervous and excited as she prepared to share her novel with the world. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine the possibilities, readers connecting with her story, finding strength in her words, and seeing their own struggles reflected in her pages. The bookstore was packed on the night of the launch. Melissa stood behind a table stacked high with copies of her novel, her name printed in bold letters on the cover. Friends, workshop peers, and even strangers lined up to meet her. Many told her how excited they were to read the book, sharing their own stories of resilience and struggle. As she signed each copy, Melissa felt a mix of pride and disbelief. She had done it, she had turned her pain into something meaningful, something that could inspire others. The event was a success, and the publisher reported strong initial sales. But the most gratifying moment came when an older woman approached her, holding the book tightly. "This story feels like mine," the woman said, her voice trembling. "Thank you for writing it." Melissa's throat tightened as she thanked the woman, realizing that her story had already begun to make an impact. That night, as she returned to her apartment, Melissa felt an overwhelming sense of fulfillment. The novel began to gain momentum through word of mouth. Readers shared their favorite passages on social media, and reviews praised Melissa's raw, honest storytelling. One review described the book as a powerful testament to the human spirit, while another called it a must-read for anyone seeking hope after hardship. The success opened doors Melissa had never imagined. Invitations to literary festivals and book clubs poured in, and her days became a whirlwind of interviews and events. At each appearance, Melissa shared the story behind the novel, speaking candidly about her experiences with Greg and her journey to rediscovery. Each event reminded her of how far she had come. She no longer felt like the timid woman who had doubted her worth. Instead, she stood tall, her voice steady, her story resonating with people from all walks of life. For the first time in years, Melissa felt truly at home in her own skin. Melissa's growing success brought her into a world she had once thought inaccessible. Invitations to speak at literary events and appear on local talk shows became routine, but each one still felt surreal. At first, she battled nerves, her voice trembling during interviews. But as she shared her journey, the nerves gave way to confidence. Audiences resonated with her story. She spoke candidly about leaving an unfulfilling marriage, rebuilding her life, and finding her voice through writing. At one festival, she ended her speech with a simple yet powerful message: "Your worth isn't determined by anyone else's opinion. It's something only you can define." The room erupted in applause, and Melissa left the stage with tears in her eyes, overwhelmed by the support. Her vulnerability became her strength. Readers sent her letters sharing how her novel had given them courage to face their own challenges. For Melissa, this was the ultimate reward, not the fame, not the financial stability, but the knowledge that her words were making a difference. While Melissa thrived, Greg's life continued to crumble. The company he had once been so proud to represent had replaced him, citing his inability to adapt to changing trends. His colleagues, tired of his arrogance, had distanced themselves, leaving him isolated. At home, the silence was deafening. The grand house that had once symbolized his success now felt like an empty shell. Greg's financial struggles mounted, forcing him to sell his car and downsize his lifestyle. Each step felt like a blow to his pride, but what stung most was hearing about Melissa's success through mutual acquaintances. "She's doing amazing things," a former colleague had remarked during a chance encounter. "Her book is everywhere. Have you read it?" Greg had laughed it off, but the comment lingered. How had Melissa, the woman he dismissed as unambitious, managed to rise so far? The realization gnawed at him, sparking a mix of envy and regret. It was at a prestigious literary gala that Greg and Melissa's paths crossed again. Melissa was the guest of honor, her novel having won a major award. Dressed in a sleek, navy blue gown, she exuded confidence as she mingled with authors, publishers, and fans. The air buzzed with admiration for her work. Greg, a shadow of his former self, had attended as a guest of someone else, hoping to network and salvage his career. He hadn't expected to see Melissa there, much less as the center of attention. As their eyes met across the room, his breath caught. She looked radiant, a far cry from the woman he used to belittle. For a moment, Greg hesitated. But then, perhaps out of curiosity or guilt, he approached her. "Melissa," he began, his voice quieter than she remembered. "It's been a long time." Melissa turned, her expression unreadable. "Hello, Greg," she said evenly. Her tone carried neither warmth nor malice, only a calm detachment. Greg fumbled for words, his once unshakable confidence nowhere to be found. "I've been meaning to reach out," he said. I want to say I'm sorry. For everything. I didn't treat you the way you deserved." Melissa studied him for a moment, her emotions swirling. She had imagined this moment countless times, rehearsing scathing remarks or triumphant declarations. But now, standing in front of Greg, she felt none of the anger she had once harbored. Instead, she felt pity for the man who had tried to diminish her and regret for the years she had spent seeking his approval. "I appreciate your apology," she said finally, her voice steady. "But I've moved on, Greg. I suggest you do the same." Her words were firm but kind, offering him closure without inviting further conversation. As she walked away, she felt an overwhelming sense of freedom. Greg watched Melissa disappear into the crowd, her poise and grace a stark contrast to the broken man he had become. He had hoped for forgiveness, perhaps even a chance to reconnect. But as he stood alone, he realized that Melissa no longer needed him or his validation. For Melissa, the encounter was a turning point. It reaffirmed how far she had come and how much she had grown. Greg's apology, while unexpected, no longer held the power to affect her. She didn't need his acknowledgement to know her worth. That night, as she returned home from the gala, Melissa reflected on the journey that had brought her here. She had faced humiliation, heartbreak, and doubt, but she had emerged stronger, more confident, and more certain of who she was. Sitting at her desk, she opened a blank document and began typing the first lines of her next novel. Melissa's life was unrecognizable from the one she had left behind. Her days were filled with creativity and purpose, a stark contrast to the stagnation she had once endured. With her first novel a resounding success, she began working on her second, a story inspired by the resilience she had witnessed in others. This time, writing felt different. The fear and doubt that had plagued her during her first novel were gone, replaced by a quiet confidence. Melissa embraced her identity as a writer, no longer questioning her place in the literary world. She traveled to book clubs and festivals, connecting with readers who saw themselves in her stories. Each interaction reinforced her belief in the power of storytelling to heal and inspire. But amid the whirlwind of success, Melissa remained grounded. She returned often to the workshop where her journey had begun, offering encouragement to new writers. "Your voice matters," she told them. "Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." The culmination of Melissa's hard work came when her first novel won a prestigious literary award. The ceremony was held in a grand hall, filled with some of the most influential figures in the literary world. Melissa, dressed in an elegant emerald gown, felt a mix of pride and disbelief as her name was announced. As she stepped onto the stage, applause filled the room. Melissa took a moment to compose herself, then addressed the audience. "This story was born out of struggle," she said, her voice steady. "But it's also a testament to the strength we all carry within us. To anyone who has ever doubted themselves or felt unseen, you are enough. Never forget that." The standing ovation that followed was overwhelming. Melissa held back tears as she left the stage, clutching the trophy that symbolized not just her achievement but the journey it had taken to get there. One morning, Melissa received a letter in the mail. The handwriting on the envelope was unmistakably Greg's. For a moment, she considered throwing it away, but curiosity got the better of her. She opened the envelope and began to read. The letter was an apology, more heartfelt than the one Greg had given in person. He acknowledged his mistakes, admitting that his pride and selfishness had driven them apart. "You were always stronger than I gave you credit for," he wrote. "I see that now, and I'm proud of the woman you've become." Melissa folded the letter and placed it in a drawer. She didn't feel the need to respond. Greg's words, while sincere, no longer carried the weight they once had. The closure she sought had come not from him, but from within herself. Melissa's voice became a beacon for others seeking strength in their own struggles. At a major literary festival, she delivered the keynote speech, her largest audience yet. The room was filled with aspiring writers, devoted readers, and people who had followed her journey from the beginning. She spoke candidly about her experiences, weaving together anecdotes from her marriage, her decision to leave, and her path to rediscovery. "Your struggles don't define you," she told the crowd. "What defines you is how you choose to move forward." Her words resonated deeply, and the applause at the end was thunderous. Afterward, people lined up to meet her, sharing their own stories of resilience and thanking her for her honesty. Melissa listened to each one, humbled by the impact her work had made. For the first time, she truly understood the power of her voice. Back at her apartment, Melissa sat at her desk, surrounded by reminders of her journey. Her awards sat on a shelf, alongside letters from readers and photos from her book events. The desk itself was cluttered with notes for her next novel, a story she hoped would inspire just as much as the last. She opened her laptop and began typing. The words flowed easily, each one a reflection of the woman she had become: strong, independent, and unafraid. As sunlight streamed through the window, Melissa paused, looking out at the bustling city below. Her life was far from perfect, but it was hers. She had rebuilt it piece by piece, and every struggle had been worth it. Smiling to herself, Melissa returned to her keyboard, ready to write the next chapter, not just in her novel, but in her life.